In this section, we're going to be covering the different ways and resources for doing your homework when it comes to a new job opportunity. Why? For one, it's expected. Whenever you're going through the interview process, there's going to be some level of expectation that you've done at least a minimal amount of research into both what the position is about, but also what the company is about and how they operate their business. At the end of the day, this information is power, because beyond just knowing about what you're getting yourself into, you also want to know the different resources for being able to figure out what it's like to actually work somewhere. The two primary methods for doing this are, firstly, knowing someone. Already knowing someone that already works at a place is the best possible way to get information about how it's like working at a company. However, because of how big the job market is, it's very likely that when looking at some opportunities, especially if the opportunity wasn't something you initiated through this person you know, you're going to have to rely on the internet, which can be very overwhelming in terms of all the information and resources you have available. We'll start with figuring out the basic information about a company. Generally speaking, this type of research is what I initially do when about to interview with a company. That first conversation with the recruiter, I'd say there's a 50-50 chance that we're not going to move forward, but in the event we do move forward, it's time to start looking at what this company does. And the easiest way to do that is simply to Google them. For example, I use Google since we all know Google, but this will not only give you some general information, in this case it's even telling me some of the ratings from places like Glassdoor's, Indeed, and AmbitionBox, but they may in fact have a career site. I can go and look at what information they're telling me about the company. Something important that I look for are a company's core values. This is because these values are so important, the company has taken the time to make this a part of their website. And so in terms of what these core values are, that's going to give you a little insight into what they want their culture to be about. At the end of the day though, you have to consider the balance. When looking at a company website, this is all the information they put there themselves. So obviously they're only going to put the most positive information forward. That's when it gets to looking at stuff which may not be positive. Firstly, I'll throw out Glassdoors.com. This is a site in which people can post salaries, jobs, interviews, and other benefit information, as well as just giving general ratings to companies. It's worth noting though, as with the rest of the internet, anyone can put mostly whatever they want. And so in a lot of cases, consider that the people that take the time to do this or write reviews are angry employees. So you have to take this information with what we call a grain of salt. Also consider that companies themselves will sometimes highly encourage employees to put positive reviews out there. So generally speaking, I look at how many actual reviews there are and take into account some of them are probably fake, some of them are just from angry, disgruntled employees, and so I try to look at the overall balance. In the example I'm showing, where a company has over 2,000 reviews and has a 2.5 rating, this company, which I have covered the name of, is obviously not a great place to work because mostly all of the reviews in this case are negative, and they're not just from one person, but in this case, hundreds of people. You can also have the opposite though. I've also seen cases where a company had a 5-star rating with 100% recommendation to a friend and 100% approval of CEO. This is very unlikely, and the fact that this company only had a dozen or so reviews tells me that this is probably mostly fluff. So again, you have to look at this and take into consideration that you have a combination of those angry employees and fake reviews. Fishbowl is a more recent development in the market, and it's geared around what seems to be Facebook for internal companies, all done anonymously. This is less about statistical information and more about people just asking questions and having conversations about different companies. Because this is so narrowly focused on individual compensations, this can sometimes not have much meaning. It can give you a little insight into how a company is paying someone, for example, in the Bay Area, but that may have nothing to do with you trying to work in New York City. I've also found that only really big companies even appear on here. Obviously, there is an intellectual property and conflict of interest type concerns by sharing these internal details, so I've always been hesitant to really use Fishbowl as a resource because again, it's completely anonymous, everyone can write whatever they want, and it's also people giving some internal company information out there, which is not good in my opinion. There's also more general resources like ZoomInfo. This is good for figuring out general information about a company such as what their reported revenue is. It also can link to some of the key players of the company to their website, tell you what industry they're in, but give you some very general info. Especially if you're researching smaller companies, this is a good way to figure out what their revenue is, if that's something that concerns you when trying to sign on. When specifically looking at startups, Crunchbase is going to be your go-to resource. This is a site dedicated to telling you where these different startups are in terms of funding and series. It will also give you a general idea of employees, the investors, similar companies, along with when it was founded. This can be important when trying to put together a picture of how stable or how willing you are to take on risk when dealing with a startup. As also linked in earlier series, I have my opportunity tracker. Inside that opportunity tracker, I have an entire tab dedicated to what I call a context-based comparison. I have all these different categories, and it's important to note that you may not care about any of these categories. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to list the things that I care about most in terms of an opportunity and rate them in 3 categories. The good, stuff that's entirely positive. The bad, the stuff that makes me think maybe this isn't a great idea. And then the ugly, the stuff that is glaringly a problem from what I'm looking at. I then use this to try to do as best as I can an apples to apples comparison for different opportunities. In my case, because I'm looking at startups, I'm including information about when it was founded, what their revenue is, and where they are in terms of funding. In my case, I'm saying that if something has been founded as far back as 2009, that's probably good. They've been around for a while. They're well into it. I also look at the revenue. If they have a high amount of revenue, for example, $38 million is high relative to a size of 200 people, I say that's good. However, when looking at a company that was founded just this year with only $1 million in revenue and has $16 million in funding, that's a very early startup in Series A. And so that becomes a big concern of mine. I've also decided to include Glassdoors. Taking into account, it can sometimes be sketchy. But when looking at the number of reviews, if it's 50 reviews and they're mostly positive, that gives me a good indication that hey, this is probably mostly a positive experience. On the opposite though, with the one that's only 5 reviews, that gives them a 5-star rating, that's obviously fake. No one's going to be perfect. There's always going to be people with issues. So that tells me the company is taking the time to try to polish their image to beyond what it really is. Also, when looking at something with a whole lot of reviews, maybe 20 or more, when I found that they're nearly all negative, that's a red flag to me, especially when they all have a common theme, which Glassdoors will give you. In the case of this one company, Company C, everyone was complaining about management being really, really mean and awful. So I've noted that as something which is ugly. It's a red flag. I then take into account my general thoughts on the company in terms of concerns. I'm concerned that it's small, but it has the benefit of growth. I'm really concerned that it's in Series A, but the benefit is I'm going to get a whole lot of equity in terms of taking on that risk. Then there's the logistics. For me, I'm looking for only remote work, so I consider a remote work good. And if something were hybrid, I'd say, well, maybe that would be a little bit bad. And also, I'm not looking to do any travel. And so one of these opportunities has 10% travel, so I've notated that as bad. Then we get into the offer specifics. This is something that you're going to have to potentially negotiate, but once you get the offer, the idea is you want to lay out all the things you care about. In my case, I'm interested in salary, bonus, the total compensation, equity options, sign-on bonus, 401k, and PTO. There are going to be more options beyond this. These are just the ones that I'm focusing on personally right now when trying to compare opportunities. And the way I compare them is I'll come up with a target salary and then notate whether it's on target, above target, or below target with my good, bad, and ugly coding system. Then, because I have to pay for a family's health insurance, I've included health insurance information as a part of the comparison. And the reason I've done that is the health insurance cost in my case, I've found can be anywhere from $400 to $600 or upwards of $600. And so when looking at these health plans, which are generally given out when you're initially talking to a company, especially after the first round of interviews, I've taken those into consideration that I'm going to be paying out of pocket a certain amount of money just for the privilege of having health insurance. Then finally, I'm going to take all these things and add them up. For example, Company A has 21 good things, 3 bad things, and 1 thing that's ugly. Then I do somewhat of a seemingly arbitrary ranking system where I take the number of good times 3, bad times 2, and then ugly times 4 and come up with a ranking. The higher the ranking, the better the opportunity is according to my system. With the lower the number, the worse the opportunity is. This is again almost entirely arbitrary. Consider at the end of the day, you can't really do a scientific comparison of opportunities. There are a lot of intangibles that simply come down to a matter of cultural fit. I just use this as a general guide to look at things from a financial, mostly financial perspective regarding whether an opportunity is going to be good for me financially or not. There's something that I'm leaving out of this, which is entirely important, which is that cultural fit. Consider that throughout the interview process, you're not the only one being interviewed. You are interviewing them. As a part of that process, you're learning about this company beyond just these tangible benefits, trying to figure out whether it's the right job title, it's the right job fit, and it's the right culture for you to function inside.